Nick Ferrari at breakfast. Call 0345 6060 973.
10 minutes before 8. I tried to remember the prices just before we gave you that news update, and I was nearly there. I was quoting, it was £4 for a bag of rubble, up to £10 for a sheet of plasterboard, and I was right, between £6 and £13 for a lavatory bowl. These were the prices that were being charged by some local authorities if you went to what I'm going to call the tip, although they have other names, local amenity sites, I think. They said, well, apparently there is a revolution on the way. It's all a load of rubbish, says the government. And here to explain why is Environment, Food and Rural Affairs Secretary George Eustice, who joins me now. Tell me about the revolution that's on the way then. Good morning, Secretary of State.
Good morning. Well, look, we've had a growing problem in recent years with fly tipping, and we've already taken measures in the past to make it easier to track that waste and make the households who are responsible for it responsible for the tipping that took place. But what we're announcing today is a further change, and that's to remove the ability of local authorities to charge people who are doing DIY work and trying to dispose of materials like plasterboard for taking it to a waste recycling centre. It's right that they should charge commercial builders for that kind of work, but for householders doing DIY work, we want them to be disposing of these materials through the correct channel, and we need to make it easy for them to do so while also clamping down on those who do fly tips. So it's a twin part to the package. One is removing those charges, and the other is supporting a number of local authorities with some quite creative use of CCTV to try to catch some of the prolific fly tippers that we're seeing in many parts of the country.
Secretary of State, if I had someone from the Local Authority Association, I would imagine they would be saying, but there are associated costs with dealing with plasterboard or old toilets or shower trays or whatever it might be, and this was our way, and now we'll have no way of meeting those funds. I sense that's what they would say. How would you respond?
Well, I suspect that the amount of money that they raised from this is probably fairly small, but probably the main reason a third of them are charging is I suspect that they will claim that it's difficult to differentiate between a commercial builder who's disposing of this and a householder. And our view is they do that in every other area. So somebody could be doing house clearance of furniture commercially. They need to identify them for that purpose, and they should be able to do the same for builders as well.
When will this actually take effect? A lot of people use the Easter weekend, of course, to do a bit of DIY or tidy up the garden or whatever it might be, Secretary of State.
Yes, we're not going to be able to do it in time for this Easter weekend, I'm afraid. But we are consulting on this measure first, which is always what you need to be able to do, and then probably introduce it later this year.
You would hope. And you also mentioned a clampdown. So that's, if you will, the domestic side of things, and the responsible householder now, he or she will take the plasterboard and the old loo and go to the tip. But you said a clampdown. A little bit more detail on that, if you would.
Well, we've issued a number of grants for pilot projects to, quite a lot of different local authorities around the country who are trying different approaches with the use of CCTV in hotspots where they're getting fly tipping taking place, so that they can capture the number plate and bring those responsible, to justice. It's often the case in many local authorities that it's a small number of people, often cowboy operators, that are going out in the middle of the night and just disposing of this material in gateways to farm fields and so on. And if you can identify the hotspots, put some temporary CCTV there and actually catch them, we might be able to make some quite rapid progress in dealing with it. So we're funding a series of different pilot schemes in that area.
Lastly on this, there were 1.1 million cases of fly tipping in England last year. What would you deem a success? How will we know if these policies, as and when they're introduced, I appreciate they're not introduced yet, but were they to be introduced, how will we know they're a success? What would you be looking to bring that number down by, Secretary of State?
Well, it's not I haven't got a sort of target number, but obviously dramatically reducing it and getting the trend, going in the right direction. And as I said, my estimate is in most of these local authorities, you're not necessarily talking about hundreds of people that are fly tipping. You're probably, in the main, for the most serious cases, looking at a handful of rogue operators who are fly tipping. If we can catch them and bring them to justice, that's a big step forward. And then for some of the more smaller scale type of fly tipping events, well, removing those charges, removes, if you like, the incentive or the excuse for that from other householders. And that combined approach we're hoping is going to get things moving in the right direction.
All right. In other matters, reminding my listeners, of course, you're Environment Secretary. What of the environmental protests at fuel depots in Hertfordshire, Warwickshire and Essex, and protesters yesterday blocking 2 central London bridges, closing those down, and sites in Warwickshire as well? Do you have sympathy with the Stop Oil protest?
Well, look, I think a right to protest is important, but not if it's disrupting other people's lives. And that's the problem with a lot of these protests. They're not just making a point and staging a protest. They're also, trying to cause havoc with other people's lives. And I think that's wrong. And that's why we're trying to make some changes to the law to deal with some of these problems of people gluing themselves to motorways and so on. It's really, not acceptable. We all recognise, actually, that we need to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, not just to deal with big challenges like climate change, but also to deal with the current problem we see now, which is an over-reliance on those few remaining countries in the world that have oil and gas reserves. So we're all moving in the right direction. This is a mainstream agenda. People really don't need to do such extreme protests to make their point heard.
As it's revealed that Sajid Javid was totally legally a non-dom prior to entering politics, is there anything you'd like to share with my listeners, Mr. Eustice?
Well, I have, Nick, very simple tax affairs. I have my MP's income and my ministerial income, and that's the end of it. So I'm not a non-dom, never have been.
Are the tax affairs of a Chancellor's wife in the public interest?
Well, look, my own view on this is those who put themselves forward for election, they are fair game. There's scrutiny on elected MPs in a way that no other people get. And so it's understandable that the Chancellor would get that scrutiny. We also all go into this knowing that to some extent, we're exposing other family members to that scrutiny as well. That goes with the territory a bit. But as to whether it's fair or right, my view is that it shouldn't be. But everybody accepts the reality that these things can be a factor. But she's given an account of her own tax affairs, made clear she's going to change her tax arrangements going forward. And the Chancellor himself has referred, his own declarations, which he says he made fully, but to Lord Geit, who's the Prime Minister's advisor on ministerial interests, to look at this.
Some are suggesting on the weekend Prime Minister Johnson's visit to Kyiv was nothing more than a publicity stunt to deflect away from Partygate and other issues. How fair a characterisation of his visit would you say that, Secretary of State?
Well, I think that's very unfair. The truth is that the invasion of Ukraine, is an incredibly serious matter. We're seeing these appalling scenes from Ukraine now, from those cities where the Russians are retreating. The UK rightly has been at the forefront of giving, military equipment to the Ukrainians to help them defend themselves. And the Prime Minister yesterday, announced a big increase in that in terms of, defensive weapons, anti-tank and anti-aircraft weapons and so on. Absolutely right that we should show solidarity with Ukraine during this most difficult moment.
And lastly, staying with the war in Ukraine and the efforts of people to come and find refuge in this country, you will be aware that it is not working well at the Home Office, Secretary of State. I remind my listeners, of course, you are not in the Home Office, you're in a different department, but Priti Patel has admitted that only around 1,200 refugees have actually got into the United Kingdom. That's, as it's revealed, 20,000 have got into Ireland, and even 10 Conservative MPs who are known to try and sponsor Ukrainians, they can't get anybody in either. Why is this such a shambles?
Well, look, my understanding is that around 40,000 Ukrainian refugees have now been approved to come to the UK under the sponsored route. And my understanding was that around 12,000 of those had, but it may be there's an error there. So 12,000 visas have been issued, just to clarify, Secretary. So 12,500 visas have been issued. You're absolutely right. But my point is only 1,200 have actually physically got into the country. And in some instances, we have Conservative MPs saying, we can't get these people either. And this is not speaking. I put it to you again. It is a shambles at the Home Office, Secretary of State. Well, I don't think it's a shambles, but Priti Patel herself is obviously on the case with this. She's been very clear that she'll make further changes, should they be needed. They've already made some changes, so removing the need, for instance, for Ukrainian passport holders to actually attend any kind of interview in person to allow them to come straight through. So some changes and improvements have been made. I'm sure that Priti Patel will be looking at this closely and making other changes, should that be required, to unblock any bottlenecks there might be in the system.
But lastly, she's been looking at it closely for 2 weeks, Secretary of State. She may as well give her a microscope. It's not going to make a blind bit of difference, is it? None of these Ukrainians get in.
Well, look, some of them are, and as you said, 12,000 visas have been issued, and around 40,000 have now been processed. So people are now starting to come through. Yes, there have been, I know I've seen reports myself of some of the glitches and some of the questions people were being asked. And I know she's working constantly to try and simplify that and clear things so that things work more smoothly.
All right, I'm grateful for your time. George Eustice, thank you. Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. Let's not forget that headline. There is a ban on council waste fees in an effort to curb fly tipping, and I think for many of you that will be very, very welcomed. 1 minute after 8, LBC News headlines.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom